right. So, as Brian said, my name is Diane Fazio, and I get to say that every day. For those in our audience who are blind or have low vision, I am a woman of Mediterranean descent with shoulder-length black hair and a light complexion. I'm wearing a purple velvet dress and seated in front of several art prints in a slightly messy room with 2 brown doors. I am member at large for the Rare Books and Manuscripts section, or RBMS, of the Association of College and Research Libraries, a division of the American Library Association, and it is through RBMS's Membership and Professional Development Committee that we bring you today's session. So welcome to the roundtable L'Esprit de Livres, Spiritualism, Magic, and the Occult in our collections. For today's presentation, we are coming to you live from across 11 time zones. Our presenters are Tansy Barton, Academic Librarian, Senate House Library, University of London. Eyob Derillo, Curator of Ethiopian Collections, the British Library. Rhiannon Knol, Associate Specialist, Books and Manuscripts Department, Christie's, New York. Kim Schwenk, Cataloger, UC San Diego, Special Collections, and Lux Mentis Booksellers. And Jay Sylvestre, Rare Book Librarian, University of Miami. You can read their biographies at bit.ly/, and this is actually the wrong link, my apologies, BK Spirit-Book Fair, and I will make sure that Brian gets that link for the YouTube. So please join me in welcoming our speakers. Today's panel addresses considerations for building critical collections of witchcraft and magic-related materials, magic and divination in Ethiopian collections, exhibitions, alchemists, women's so-called recipe books, and collectors of magical artifacts, the occult and paranormal as academic subjects and bias in collections, and the long reach of celebrity fascination with unexplained phenomena. Are you intrigued? We hope you are. Our agenda is brief. We began with a welcome, continue with acknowledgements and access information, followed by our panel. Each of the 5 panelists has roughly 13 minutes to present for a total of 65 minutes, followed by a question and answer portion, as Brian mentioned. So if you're counting, you'll see that we've got plenty of time. Now, on to my announcements. Today, I am presenting from traditional Osage lands. We invite you to enter your address at native-land.ca as we take a moment to recognize and respect Indigenous peoples as traditional stewards of the land, as well as the enduring relationship that exists between Indigenous people and their traditional territories. If you'd like to access closed captioning for this session, please feel free to use webcaptioner.com, which is a free service available using the Google Chrome browser. And the address is on screen. This session, as you know, is being broadcast live on YouTube and recorded. All attendees will be muted and your video cameras disabled during the presentation for better viewing and listening experience. But to ask questions and participate, and we hope you do, in the discussion portion of our session, you can comment in the chat, which will be monitored throughout. Please use hashtag Brooklyn Book Fair on social media and keep up with fair events on Instagram and Twitter. And if you were looking for the Brooklyn Book Festival, well, we're delighted to have you, but that starts elsewhere on September 18th, or 28th, sorry. So, without further ado, our first speaker is Tansy Barton. Tansy?
Thank you to Brian and Marvin, and also to Diane for organising this panel and inviting me to speak today. I'm an academic librarian. I'm part of the Modern Collections team at Senate House Library, and one of our main duties is developing and promoting our collections. My main subjects are actually manuscript and print studies, but after several years of working in the library's special collections, I'm also responsible for developing the library's collections in the paranormal, occult and magical, and many other subjects associated with these. And this area is now one of our research strengths of the collections, after spending some time being awkwardly combined with psychology. And on the left here is the new webpage on our website, which is currently under development, introducing this as one of the research strengths. Although we have had web pages for particular collections, this is the first time we have promoted this subject as something that we specialise in this way. The collections at Senate House began with the man in the bed on the right, Mr. Harry Price, who is here investigating a haunted bed in Chiswick with Cyril Joad. If I recall correctly, various phenomena were reported around the bed, but Price and Joad did not witness anything when they stayed there. This isn't the best known image of Price, but which is probably his spirit portrait by William Hope, but it is one of my favourites. Price was involved in psychical research from the late 1910s, with his first high-profile investigation being the exposure of William Hope and his spirit photography. He went on to conduct many investigations into unexplained phenomena, such as testing mediums, including Eileen Garrett, Mina Crandon, the Schneider brothers and Helen Duncan, investigating Jeff the Talking Mongoose, the Indian rope trick and firewalking, and experimenting in magic on the Brocken, with his most famous case being the haunting of Borley Rectory. He created his own national laboratory of psychical research, published many books, gave lectures, corresponded with many of the major figures of psychical research of the early 20th century. He was also an expert self-publicist and embraced the media and new technology in the course of his work, as well as some more unsavoury practices and connections. Next slide, please. He was also an avid collector of contemporary material on unexplained phenomena, as well as antiquarian and historical works. His collection was housed for many years in his national laboratory in South Kensington and was intended to be used for the student or investigator of the paranormal to detect false phenomena or to prove when they had discovered something genuine. Price was also a true bibliophile of a collector, amassing multiple editions of books, including the book that started his interest, Professor Hoffman's Modern Magic. We have 13 or plus editions of that in the collection now. And he prized rare and early and first editions. He wrote numerous articles on his library, staged exhibitions of rare, old and curious works on magic, witchcraft, legerdemain, charlatanism and the occult sciences, and published a short title catalogue of the collection. In the late 1930s, Price started looking for a new home for his library, and it eventually came to the University of London in 1936 and was bequeathed following his death in 1947. The library was given the grand name of the Harry Price Library of Magical Literature, and it became one of the university library's most significant named special collections, alongside the Goldsmiths Library of Economic Literature and the Serling Library of First and Fine Editions of English Literature. The subject coverage of the collection is wide-ranging, taking in historical and contemporary works on witchcraft, haunting, spiritualism, the many meanings of magic, including conjuring and allied arts, psychical research, occultism, demonology, and many more subjects. For a small bequest that came with the collection, materials continue to be added in all areas, as well as new subjects such as the occult and pagan revivals, counterculture movements and modern esoterica, and conspiracy theories and UFOs. When the collection first arrived at the library in 1937, it contained 4,376 books, 5,343 pamphlets, and 725 volumes of periodicals. And it has grown considerably since then. There's currently 15,000 entries in the catalogue of the library collection alone. Pictured here are just a few of the books in the collection. Of course, Price's own works are represented in their entirety and in multiple copies. This is his second book on Borley Rectory, published in 1946 with its original dust jacket. Next is a mass market Swedish book from 1925, a compilation of practical and divination and magic with one of my favourite cloth illustrated covers. And one of the older books in the collection, a 1494 edition of Malleus Maleficarum with a contemporary calf binding. Material comes in a wide range of formats, as well as printed book. The collection is rich in pamphlets, off-prints, pressed cuttings and scrapbooks, as well as extensive holdings of ephemera, manuscripts, films, photographs, correspondence and slides, recording the investigative activities of Harry Price and his associates. Pictured on the right here is what Price claimed was the box sealed by the prophetess Joanna Southcott before her death. It came into his possession by slightly questionable means, and the contents include a nightcap, coins and tokens, a purse, and a lottery ticket. Next slide, please. And this leads on. This leads on to our archive collections. Showing on the right here is part of a film from the Harry Price archive of the Brocken experiment, when Price invited the world's media to cover his recreation of a High German occult ritual to transform a he-goat into a young man staged on the Brocken Mountains with their long association with witchcraft. Price claimed it was an experiment and a demonstration of the fallacies in the belief in the occult and magical. And spoilers for the video, but the goat remained a goat. It was perhaps a little bit more of a publicity stunt than an experiment. The goat went on to be purchased by Horace Golding, who included it in his magic show, recreating the experiment, but where the transformation was a success. As well as Price's archive, including materials such as this and his correspondence, manuscripts, objects, photographs, scrapbooks, the library's acquired several other archives around spiritualism and psychical research in the occult. Represented on the left is one of the most significant, the collection of anthropologist, writer and investigator Eric Dingwall. It was bequeathed to the library following his death in 1986. Pictured is this box of necessities for investigation, an idea he claimed Harry Price stole from him. A large part of the collection consists of Dingwall's scrapbooks of research material and index boxes of slips cataloguing his research. Scrapbooks are rich in range of material, including correspondence and photographs, as well as cuttings and pamphlets. The collection also includes his extensive correspondence, which reflects to some extent the history of psychical research in the 20th century. The correspondence is closed under the terms of Dingwall's will until 2025, but will represent a significant research resource when it is open. And there's the goat. Next slide, please. The Brocken film featured in a longer compilation with footage of the Indian rope trick and firewalking in our 2019 exhibition Staging Magic, and was actually one of the most popular exhibits. The exhibition covered 500 years of conjuring books from the Harry Price Library, from the 16th century with Reginald Scott's The Discovery of Witchcraft, the first book in English to describe conjuring tricks, up to the end of the golden age of magic in the 1930s, reflecting the strengths of holdings for the subject in the collection. The exhibition included books, prints, playbills and posters, and archival material relating to Price's life and work and collecting. The central rationale behind it was to promote the collections and holdings in this area to an audience beyond our usual academic stakeholders. And I think it was a subject that had great appeal to the public's imagination. And by the sounds of our exhibitions, it was very popular and successful. I think we particularly benefited from similar exhibitions around the same time. The Ashmoleans' wonderful Spellbound exhibition in 2018 and Smoke and Mirrors at the Wellcome collection that coincided with ours and looked more at the psychology of magic and intersections with spiritualism and psychical research. We lent material to both of those, from our collections to both of those exhibitions. But I think the success of all three shows showed a continuing fascination with all aspects of magic. Also pictured here is one of my favourite exhibits from the exhibition, a playbill from the later years of Bartholomew Fair, where many great magicians performed. This one is for Signor Capelli and his wonderful learned cats, who would perform all sorts of marvellous feats, such as roasting coffee, ringing bells and turning a spit. The cleverest would draw water from a well and understood commands from her master in both French and Italian. Next slide, please. To conclude, I want to mention one of the most enjoyable aspects of my job, and that is developing our paranormal collections and the audience of library users we serve. As I mentioned earlier, the Harry Price Library has a small fund for new material. This has been used to buy anything in the subject area, including popular and general works and academic publishing. As the collection is part of our special collections, this has meant that readers are asked to use these books in the same way as they would any other special collections book. And for me, I feel this does put a barrier around the material and make it slightly less accessible for a variety of reasons. But for the first time last year, and luckily again this spending year, I've had a small budget to develop these subjects for the library's modern collections, which means we can put material onto the open access shelves, or they can be added to the collection as ebooks. Pictured here are 4 recent titles added, and as with the Harry Price Library, the subject coverage can be quite broad, ranging from academic monographs to popular works and small publishers. It's allowed me to really start expand and diversify the coverage of the collection, as Price's collection came from a very particular point of view and a point in time, and very much represented, although he was very wide-ranging in his interests, very much represented his views on unexplained phenomena and psychical research. It also meant that I can refocus the spending of the Harry Price Library in more specialist areas, so on more rare and antiquarian material, limited editions and pamphlets, and recently on zines and small magazines. An example here is Hellbore, and I'm indebted to one of my colleagues, Leila Kazir, for leads on these, who knows far more about zines than I do. And collection development always goes hand in hand with who is using our collections now and in the future. The library's collecting policies have always been centred around both serving our current academic needs and building our collections for the future. Our core users are students, academics and researchers of the University of London, as well as institutions in the UK and internationally. Many courses at the university's college and schools include units on medieval and early modern history and literature covering aspects of belief in magic and witchcraft. And there are research centres in the psychology of magic and belief in the paranormal. And this is reflected more widely in research and academic networks on the cultural significance of the magic and the occult. With these collections in particular, I think there has always been users beyond the academic community. And one of our big tasks is to think about how we can make these collections more accessible to those groups beyond our traditional users, whether it's through open shelf collections, ebooks, digitisation, looking at how different groups access the library and use the library and special collections, or looking at different forms of engagement such as events and exhibitions, web displays and teaching sessions. Thank you.
Thank you, Tansy. That was great. Up next, we have Eyob Derillo. And just before I let Eyob take the reins, I just wanted to address a couple questions that I've seen in the YouTube chat. The captioning service is webcaptioner.com. It's just its own link. And it's my understanding that Marvin has added the link that's correct for everyone's full bios in the chat on YouTube. So please take a look at those 2 things. Up next, we have Eyob Derillo. Eyob, please.
Thank you very much. I really wanted to be in New York personally. I had the opportunity to visit America a year ago for the first time. And I really enjoyed New York. It felt like being in the movies. I was very familiar with all the buildings and places. So what I wanted to present today, just a brief introduction to the library's collection of magic scrolls. These are amulet scrolls, which are worn, I'll explain later, and divination books or divination manuals in the British Library's collection. My interest in magic really began before I started my PhD about 10 years ago. I was very much fascinated by amulet scrolls. It was something that was never really taken serious in Western scholarship. There were just a few handbooks, articles and introductory books out there. And there was not much interest in it. So the British Library's collection and also other institutes in Europe were not particularly interested in scrolls. Physically, their appearance didn't appeal to them, and the talisman, the arts drawing didn't appeal to them. In 2017, I had the amazing opportunity to work on an exhibition titled Harry Potter and the History of Magic. So I was one of the co-curators. So I was able to squeeze in a couple of Ethiopian magic scrolls, as well as divination books, and in particular one incantation to change yourself into a lion was very popular amongst the kid. And that exhibition was very important in that it did introduce people to the library's collection of amulet scrolls. So I'm gonna be really fast now. So next slide, please. So just to sort of give you a background to Ethiopia, the current location of Ethiopia is in East Africa. It's recorded in history, in Greek history, as well as in Egyptian hieroglyphics. We get the mention name of Ethiopia and its relationship to sort of the early Mediterranean world is very clear. Of course, the map here is not really accurate, and sometimes Ethiopia covers half of Africa. This is just to give you a general background. Next slide, please. So this is the current location of Ethiopia, and it's in East Africa. It's close to Egypt and Sudan, so you could see that it's, you know, part of Africa as well as very much connected to the Eastern world. And this is very significant because when we go on to the next slide, the language spoken in Ethiopia is Ge'ez, as you can see on the next slide, which is a Semitic language, South Semitic language, so very, very much closely related to Arabic and other parts, and other Semitic languages like Syriac. So today, Ge'ez is only used in the liturgical language of the church. It's not much used in writing. It is classified as Afro-Asiatic language, which some have proposed Ge'ez sort of being probably the original, Ethiopia being the original homeland of Semitic language. Of course, this is disputed. And this inscription that you see here is again demonstrates the early Ethiopian sort of connection to the other parts of the Mediterranean world and the Middle East. It's inscription in three languages: Sabian, Ge'ez, and Greek. If we go to the next slide. So the British Library's collection of, so there is also the sort of prehistory of Ethiopia again, its connection to the Red Sea and Yeha, and in particular to the connection of the early moon god, Al-Maqaha, which again has not been that much researched. Yeha is a beautiful place to visit. The connection to early Sabian architecture is amazing. And this current construction here, a couple of inscriptions that were found. So its history is great. So this is just to familiarize yourself. Next, please, next slide. Again, the great part of what we know about Ethiopia in terms of the archaeological evidence is the Aksum kingdom, which started from the 300 BC and continued right down to the 9th century, to the sort of the end of the Aksum period. Aksum had great trade with other culture, so it was able to import ideas as well as export. And if we can just go on to the next slide, might have to wrap it up. We might have to go a bit fast here because I just realizing that what time hasn't been good. So if you can go up to a couple of slides, please. A bit more, second slide. Yes, okay, so the British Library's collection, this is perfect, of Ethiopian manuscript, a number around 400 manuscripts. Most of these were bought around 1844. They were acquired from number of missionaries who were coming to the United Kingdom, and they were very much interested in sort of theological text and early biblical works. So at this stage, there wasn't that much of a great collection, but the two important collections were the Harleian manuscripts. So this is the two collection that were part of the British Library's Foundation collection. If we go into the next slide, please. So the 74 codexes that get added by 1840, and by 1844 we have a very interesting catalog, which is in Latin, lists mostly works closely related to theological texts, not much taking interest in magic. But there are a great number of magic manuscripts there that were not really catalogued properly. If we go on to the next slide. So the amulet scrolls are really great part of Ethiopian culture. Although unfortunately, most have not survived. They are meant to be worn. They're not meant to be read. One has to keep them away from water. They contain a lot of information about society, the whole the ownership, as well as the style of these amulets, the origins of these amulets have always been a great interest. So the British Library's collection of amulet scrolls, they number around 40, making them, this also includes divination manuscripts, making them probably the biggest in Europe. But the largest collection of such writing outside of Ethiopia is in the Princeton University, where there are about 500 amulet scrolls, which were brought back by the German philologist Knol. Lippmann was also the first person to. Next slide. So I've selected two here to give you an example. The most important one, these are all digitized and I've cataloged them with some great details. These two are my favorite ones. OR 12859. It's an 18th century manuscript. It's really beautifully illustrated with a number of talisman as well as figurative drawings of demons. This manuscript was produced for, my suspicion is a noble person, because it also contains protection from knife and spears and to be victorious at war, also protection to have a fear, like a grace to be to sort of come over your enemy. The owner's name has been erased, so we're not particularly sure who owned it. And with the manuscript, we also found this beautiful silver case, and we're not sure whether this is part of the scroll yet, but it was found. And this collection came into the library much after the so-called Magdala manuscripts, which were mostly looted, in 1868. The scrolls don't form part of the Magdala collection. Interestingly enough, there are only two scrolls dealing directly with magic. If we go on to the next slide. And the other aspect of the collection that we have is what we called a magic handbook. This is just to make fun. Magic handbooks, what we mean by magic handbooks, if we go on the next slide, are practitioners' handbook, which contain tons of information, amulets, and we find it very difficult sometimes to decipher these handbooks. But they are really the source of the scrolls and how scrolls are made. Here, 3 brilliant examples. Again, they're all been digitized. So if anybody wants to send me a quick email, I'm happy to kind of show you. And if we go into the next slide, please. So again, the practitioners here for me have been a fascination. They are described as Daptara, highly learned mathematician, the equivalent of the alchemy experts. But again, they're sort of neglected in the study of Ethiopian studies. There's not much that we know whether they were sometimes ordained priests as well. So they are the producers of this book, and the handbook that we saw belongs to them. So if we go on to the next slide, please. So the divination manuals, we have quite a lot in the British Library. One particular interest I have, which I'm working on my PhD, is this manuscript, which is a divination manual titled Audanegus, the Cycle of Kings. It uses a system of numerology as well as rivers to predict the outcome of a fortune. Particularly, this manuscript is interesting because it is one of the early ones that came to the library in 1844. On the hardback, on the cover of the manuscript, Kraft, who brought this manuscript back, was a German missionary stroke linguist who was in Ethiopia, noted that this manuscript was actually formally, officially banned in Ethiopia, forbidden. Next slide, please. The other collection, which has kind of been sort of neglected, is the print collection. We don't really have much in terms of magic or amulets, but there are a number of Amharic books on medicine, and they tend to kind of give us a really interesting view because they were mostly written in the 1950s. This is a collection that it needs to grow. The library could acquire more. So this is something I'm working at the library to kind of increase the collection of contemporary material. And if we go into the next slide, I hope we have enough time here for a quick bibliography of important works that deals with magic. And one of them is a recent article I wrote for the Getty, which is available. I'm happy to supply anyone with bibliography, and thank you very much. It was really fast.
Yeah, you did a wonderful job. Thank you so much for your contribution.
Thank you. This is the problem of over preparation.
It's great. We have plenty of time to talk at the end, so wonderful. Yeah. Up next, we have Rhiannon Knol. Rhiannon, are you ready? Unmute you. One moment. There we go.
Now.
Yeah,
Good.
You're good.
Oh, by the way, that was very wonderful, and I'm happy to sacrifice any amount of my time, honestly, to hear more about Ethiopian scrolls. I'm a specialist in the Christie's books department now, but actually going to be mostly talking about my experience working with a particular collection of esoteric, particularly alchemical manuscripts at the Getty Research Institute. And kind of, rather than getting into the nitty-gritty of what is alchemy, the history of the collection itself and the people and ideas that helped build it in the wild world of 1920s esoteric Los Angeles. So if you don't know, I guess we can go to the first slide, the next slide. If you don't know that much about it, the Getty Research Institute is in Los Angeles, and it's a program of the Getty Trust that's actually separate from the museum. So it's up there on the hill in Brentwood, but it works a little differently over there. Instead of primarily collecting art for display, they collect material for the study of art. Everything from Renaissance printed books and manuscripts to modern artist archives and artist books. So it's a specific topic, but interpreted really broadly. And the GRI acquired the Manly Palmer Hall collection of alchemical books and manuscripts, which is described on this page a little bit, in 1995. And could we go to the next slide? So I have to kind of start by telling you about Manly Palmer Hall, which was an exciting thing to learn about when I started there. He was born in Canada in 1901, but moved to Los Angeles in 1919 trying to find his estranged mother, and almost immediately became involved in this rich and kind of crazy world of LA esotericism. He got put in charge of a church, I think when he was basically still a teenager, a New Age church, and began to give increasingly popular lectures that just attracted huge crowds on kind of mystical ideas, Hindu philosophy to Greek atomism, sort of bringing all of these ideas that he had become interested in researching, both Western and non-Western, into a kind of unified field theory of wisdom. And he was famous for giving these speeches without notes, totally extemporaneously, not even drinking a glass of water. He just talked for, hours. Almost at the same time as a lot of kind of Christian revival things were going on. This was the other side of that, like getting people riled up about, the mysticism of Neoplatonism. So in 1928, I don't know, I hope that you can see his face here because he has such a piercing glare. Of course, that's him. In 1928, he wrote his most famous book, which is called The Secret Teachings of All Ages. Simple. Which was published by Description and basically distilled all the knowledge of his lectures into a literary form packaged for consumption kind of across the US. And celebrities were into it, artists were into it. Supposedly Harry Truman had a copy of it. He was penetrating. And it really kind of set him into a celebrity that was not just based in Southern California. By the time of the 1920s, he attracted the attention of a wealthy woman named Carolyn Lloyd, who just began bankrolling him. She had oil money from Ventura County and paid for him to travel around and give his lectures. And also he began collecting antiquarian books and manuscripts. That's kind of when this started. And he would travel around Europe, basically taking advantage of kind of the depressed economy over there in the same way that many institutions were at the time, and buying all kinds of interesting things with a kind of very specific view in mind to what he was interested in. Apparently mostly bought through Sotheby's, so you can't win them all. And I should add, the collection that's at the Getty is primarily European material, but he collected Chinese oracle bones and Shinto texts and Tibetan manuscripts, as well as sort of early photography from Mexico of the pyramids and things like that. So really wide ranging. And in 1934, he founded what you see on the screen here, this building, the Philosophical Research Society, which you can still find and consult the library of on Los Feliz Boulevard in Los Angeles. It was a home for his book collection, as well as a place where people from all over could come and pursue the studies that he promoted. He had a place, and this allowed him to kind of settle into his celebrity. He became sort of a figure of legend, rumors of a magical birth, magical powers, his membership in secret organizations. As you can imagine, he attracted a lot of acolytes, a lot of interesting people. This is LA where Scientology started. All kinds of kind of wacky organizations started them. But actually, apparently Manly Hall actually helped the LADA's office kind of go after cults that were kind of bilking people for money. And he kind of put himself up as like the good guy cult figure in LA at the time. He died in 1990, and his death, unfortunately, was kind of shrouded in almost Raymond Chandler-esque mystery and kind of turmoil. One of the acolytes taking care of him, 6 days before Manly Hall's death, there was a new will, willing everything to him, cutting the wife out of the inheritance. His widow, Marie Bauer Hall, really thought that it was a murder, and there was a long legal dispute afterwards. She was granted their house and also a portion of the alchemical manuscripts. And that is the collection that became the Manly Palmer Hall collection at the Getty. That was a quick run through. There's more to say, but can we see the next slide? So the Getty Research Institute has, as I mentioned, kind of a strict collecting remit. It only focuses on art history. The Manly Palmer Hall collection was acquired at the time for the history of visual symbolism and its contribution to that, which was art history not as just who painted what and when, but the history and life of images themselves. And in a way that is kind of similar to what Abby Warburg was doing in Germany and the UK earlier in the 20th century. And I have a picture here of his Mnemosyne Atlas, which was a similar idea almost to what Hall was interested in, of a philosophical kind of visual encyclopedia where ideas and images interact and like express all knowledge. And there's a very cool exhibition up in Berlin, if you're lucky enough to be there right now, on that, by the way. Can we see the next slide? So something that this time that I spent working with this exhibition was kind of culminated, or this collection culminated in an exhibition, and which part of basically expressed that an aspect not fully appreciated about the collection until a bit later after it was acquired by the current Rare Books curator, David Braffman, is that the history of alchemy is also the history of the materiality of art. It's literally how you make paint. That's what the alchemist in this Cornelis Bega painting is doing. I think you can see on the windowsill, there's like a little bit of red in a handkerchief, and that's cinnabar for making vermilion paint. And the kind of wild hermaphrodite creature down at the bottom is a picture of the chemical wedding from the Atalanta Fugians, which, in addition to many other allegorical interpretations, can be interpreted kind of straightforwardly as a combination of Hermes, which is the metal mercury, and Venus, the metal copper, and the process of mercury amalgam gilding, which is, you know, one way that you can turn something that's not gold into gold, or at least make it look like it. So the idea behind the exhibition, which was in 2016 and then in 2017 in Germany, was that the combination of these ideas, right, that there's a real material history, but linked always to the ideas and the philosophy. And they go together really well in the topic of alchemy. Can I see the next slide? So this aspect of it was kind of shared by something that I discovered looking at the collection, specifically at women owners of the collection. And so when we gave tours, I gave a public tour every week of this exhibition. People loved it. I think they appreciated our general thesis about alchemy and art history, you know, in a more straightforward way, but they had lots of other ideas too. And people would come back multiple times to tours. They would want to talk to me a really long time after the tour. I think the imagery of alchemy is so generative and exciting. It really, people just brought so much of their selves to it. We had a lot of people from the Jungian Institute come, and a woman invited me to live with her in Peru and study alchemy, which was very nice of her, but I did not go. And I found this reflected in the women owners of the Alchemical collection as well. It's well known now, I think, that, you know, oh, there's recipe literature. Women did recipes, so they did the practical side of alchemy. But they were certainly not only interested in the kind of kitchen alchemy. And the women's ownership inscriptions on the books in the collection really do reflect interested in kind of theoretical and philosophical ideas associated with it. Can I see the next slide? So this is just one woman whose name actually came up a lot in the books in the collection. And it's Elizabeth Worcester Mills, who, was a Theosophist. She was associated with the Theosophical Society in New York. She was the daughter of a prominent Swedenborgian minister, so already kind of on the kind of religious vanguard at the time. And she was involved with the society founded in 1875 by Helena Blavatsky, which was really influential on Manly Hall. And actually, to bring us back to LA in the next slide, even though Elizabeth Mills was in Massachusetts, LA actually has a huge theosophical aspect to it, as you might imagine. So Beechwood Canyon in LA was actually originally kind of settled as a theosophical commune, and their headquarters was at a place called the Crotona Inn, which I was very excited to learn this because I lived not very far from here when I was there. And so they had their headquarters, and then the wealthy Theosophists built kind of exciting, wacky houses all around it. And while they eventually kind of decamped to Ojai, I think there's still a lot of kind of interesting philosophical things going on in Ojai. Their influence kind of stays today in the form of the Bezant Lodge, which is pictured here, which is actually one of the first silent movie theaters in LA, but is now run by the Theosophists and is also the home of the Ecclesia Gnostica, the Gnostic church in LA. I think actually in America, this is their headquarters. And their bishop, Stephen A. Haller, knew Manly Hall, saw him speak, and actually while I was at the Getty, he came to the reading room to look at some of the manuscripts, which he had last seen at the Philosophical Research Society during the lifetime of Manly Hall, and kind of shared stories with us. And it was a really amazing experience. I think to me, working at an institution at that time, you kind of think of once something arrives in your collection, it's in a way its history is almost over, like it's taken out of time, it's somewhere else. But this was a person from kind of the past life of the book that I could actually talk to, which was very exciting. Could I see the next slide? So a lot of the items in the collection attract a ton of attention from people who aren't necessarily actually looking into art history. And one of them is the triangle manuscript of the Comte de Saint-Germain, who you might know of if you've read Foucault's Pendulum, which you might be able to guess by now is my favorite novel. But sort of a legendarily immortal alchemist who served the courts of Europe. And this book is in code, but Manly Hall or someone working for him solved the code and also translated it into what is kind of a French ritual text. And so people would just come to kind of commune with this manuscript and look at it, which I always thought was very interesting. Can I see the next slide? Trying to go quickly. So now I work at Christie's, and instead of developing one particular collection, I kind of look at much wider range of material, and I also look at it for a wider range of reasons. And I've really enjoyed kind of figuring out what draws people to specific books. And here we have the Ripley Scroll, which is a kind of monumental, gigantic, you may have seen this before if you're interested in alchemy, allegorical work. And we sold one in 2017, which is now at Princeton, where, I think they have another one, and there's a great scholar there, Jenny Rampling, who does research on them. And they're going to be exhibited next year. But there, there's the smaller picture things too. And this little edition of Paracelsus here is a book that was not in great condition. It had the boards off. It was a little bit falling apart. And it's not that rare of an edition, but it has the most amazing marginalia. So when you read it, it's like you're reading it along with this other person who definitely was an alchemist. And that adds such a special aspect to it that you almost don't mind that it's falling apart. In fact, that adds to its charm because that's part of its life. Wrapping things up now, can I make a final statement? So all of these things, I have really enjoyed thinking about magical books. And I think the concept of a book as a teacher is so important, especially in alchemy. And there's a story of the first century alchemist known as Pseudo-Democritus. And he writes in the Physica Kai Mystica that his master died before passing on all the secrets that he needed. So he tried to resurrect his master's ghost. And the ghost said, I can't give you any information across the veil of the dead, but the books are in the temple. The books are in the temple. And then in a kind of Scooby-Doo-esque scene, he goes in the temple and a panel pops open and the books are there that share the secrets. So my point here is I think just that, books let us talk to the dead. They have their own lives. I think all of us feel this, but some more literally than others, that books really are magic, whether you're an institution or a private person. That's all. Sorry. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Rhiannon. Up next, we have Kim Schwenk. And Kim is coming to us from California. So the absolute west of our production today. There you go.
Hello. Yes. Hello, everyone. I'm presenting from recognized Kumeyaay Nation, currently on fire, unfortunately. We will make it. I'm really grateful to be in this fantastic company, and I really hope to spark some ideas about thinking about developing critical collections of witchcraft and magic, and that's magic with a K, related materials. Admittedly, this is kind of geared towards institutional collecting. However, private collecting may benefit from a few of these recommendations I have. Like my bio says, I've worked through this plan of action. I've worked both as a bookseller and a bibliographic specialist cataloger. In terms of where witchcraft falls in sort of the occult spectrum, occult is rather a broad umbrella term. Witchcraft is a facet of that, an element. It's often even an action arm of the occult, of magic. And that could be wart cunning, spellcraft, spirit work, and it's often very misunderstood and very much contested. So I bought my first witchcraft book by the famed wizard, British wizard Raymond Buckland, titled Scottish Witchcraft back in the mid-80s. And it was my first introduction to witchcraft and the traditional craft. rather than how many people were and are put on trial or to death for practicing witchcraft. So it informed much of my perspectives later as a researcher in lieu of that. Sort of now as a cataloger applying bibliographic description and subject analysis, I'm more conscious about the materials of what something is versus what something is about. And so this concept applies to witchcraft works, actually, what they are about, or if they are actually practicing witchcraft books. These are kind of general categories supplied to context the development, this collection development, but a lot of those materials should consider a few elements, which I'm going to talk about. And this is kind of a comment too on the state of book collecting, etc. So next slide, please. The first thing I'm going to talk about is observation and practice. When thinking about the areas to develop materials concerning witchcraft, this is certainly not limited to, but we can discern a lot of materials are either about witchcraft, the document the history, their scholarship, their observation of an aspect of witchcraft, or they are actually nodes of practice. So that might mean a practical spell book, a how-to or a manual, a theoretical application of magic, recipes, herbals, a grimoire, or a book of shadows. Both are forms of documentation. Can we go to the next slide? Both of these works or ideas about these works are documentation, but the perspectives of them, the books differ in that there might be an observer or a casual observer or an outside recorder or documenter of these books, rather than a firsthand documentation of someone, a practitioner, or there might also be a community recorder as well. Next slide. The second thing I want collection developed to consider is language. And when we often look at editions when collecting, this could be in the first English language edition, first printing, a limited edition, or beyond. I think it's really important to start considering both material published in other published languages and or translations of text. Next slide, please. And depending on the demographic of your institution or your community, this is not just only about inclusivity, but it's also about comprehensive collecting. For example, to have iterations of book in Spanish, something that the areas that I work in demographically for Spanish-speaking communities, I think is really important for those constituents within your institution, but also to advocate the relationship for partnerships with international publishers, international booksellers. Next slide. So intersectionality and intercontextuality, all right? This is sort of a mouthful of words, but in academia, a lot of these words get tossed around a lot. And much of it is scholar speak, I realize, if it's not applied. So I think particularly for institutional collecting, I feel that there is a responsibility to be intersectional. I also think that a well-composed collection development policy for that is really key. So next slide, please. It would be really great if folks that collect in witchcraft areas could access and afford an early print copy of the Malleus Maleficarum, or have it as a gift from someone. This book being one of the most well-known 15th century manuals of witchcraft persecution. And the book, it's also become sort of this pop icon, pop culture iconography. It's referenced in pop culture TV, movies. And it's also, because of that, it's become fetishized in a way. It's really difficult to read, actually. I've read the English language. Have you read it? It's kind of difficult to get through, but it's, regardless of the language that it's in, I think that it's very pivotal as an object as a specimen of early printing, but also mainly in the content and context of its collecting reaction, the reaction to it in conjunction and around this book. So the Malleus Maleficarum is really important, I think, in terms of the other materials that are relative to its contents. And that has really enlightened a lot of constructive conversation and criticism wise. For example, certainly subjects of women in law come to mind, but also on feminism, image of the witch in ephemera and advertising, have some visual images there, race, identity, exploitation, and body image, gender identity, and queer movement, including, and this is a quote, how it connects the history of persecution of witches with the history of the persecution of gender non-conforming people and homosexuals. And thanks to the good folks at Camp Books for that. This broadside here on the bottom left is from Camp Books, printed of a quote from Dr. Leo Martello, Radical Queer Witch. And it just emphasizes the materiality of print as a witchcraft statement using print media as platform. Also, another importance of physical print would be witchcraft in art and sexuality, witchcraft and the relationship with nature and environmentalism, and sort of so forth. You can see the tangential topics coming out of here. So it's really something to think about in terms of collecting that is useful and interdisciplinary, an opportunity to be multi-layered, but also providing a lot of rich instruction opportunities. Next slide. Desettling, okay. Another buzzword around academia and a lot of activism circles. So what this really means in terms of the relationship to this topic, in terms of these physical materials, is essentially to regenerate narratives about witchcraft creators and records of instances of witchcraft, to take witchcraft out of a colonialized and ethnographic model of otherness of witches. Next slide. And typically that's something collected institutionally. That could mean that collecting materials in terms of this that point out witchcraft, the exoticism of indigenous and non-European ethnographic sources of practitioners, but also it could also favor works that you could do and favor works written by BIPOC, which is Black, Indigenous, persons of color, as scholars and as practitioners. It's really not a complex collection development idea here. What it means is that you need to research, you need to purchase and discover those works and really vet those sources. As example, zines and community print works, as seen here, are very inexpensive, accessible, but also really important print examples of social records, many of which are focusing on these ideas and these issues. I realize that a lot of places institutionally have policies or endowments that dictate a lot of your collection development, or personally, you may only be interested in collecting British or Celtic magic. But I think though that institutions that have broad policies of collecting witchcraft should consider the lack of addressing their lack of representation in these collections. It really supports interdisciplinary collection development, but also is because of an evolving student demographic and critical curriculum, if you acknowledge the desettling of your collections. Next slide, please. So function, how do we apply this? How do we do the work? This is something that's really important to apply these. You just necessarily not just talk about it, but do some action here. Next slide. And I've tried to apply these methodology as a bookseller, but also in my cataloging as well. And we often come up with a lot of things to do. We collaborate, we advocate for materials, and we can repatriate as well. What does that mean? It could mean we work with other libraries. We partner with other libraries that also have broad witchcraft collections. Be very specific about your collection. That comes out in your collection development policy. Funding contemporary authors, looking at the now. There's a lot of material out there now currently being published. It opens doors to partnerships, trust building with communities, and creates student projects and research opportunities. This kind of functional collection development supports the hiring, and here's the repatriation, hiring and paying of subject specialists, language specialists if you want translations of materials for digital or exhibitions, community consulting, actually going into the community and working with folks, but also generating projects could be for outreach projects like printing workshops, zine making, etc. Cataloging too, which is this middle 650, which is a subject heading for works, can be enhanced. Also with subject and genres, even adding some bookseller notes in tandem that help identify people as creators, printers, binders, paper makers, and that can really help with access and discovery in your catalogs. But it also supports the visualization and the recognizing of your authority work for people so that they're not hidden and lost in your catalogs as far as their cultural identity. So lastly, I'm going to just say two things about this. I will say I acknowledge collecting within the scope of your interest. That's awesome. But I will tell you that there's more out there in magic and witchcraft than Aleister Crowley. And a lot of cranky old white guys. There's so much being created currently that is very important and very unseen. And secondly, this topic, like many other topics, is living. It's a living and practiced by a lot of people. And so it is helpful if you are developing in this area to be mindful, to be very widely acknowledged cultural communities. And it's not a vacuum. Be smart and be genuine about your pursuits. I have my email here at the bottom, and I'd like to thank these folks for providing a lot of this material. So thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Kim. That's my timer going off. So we did great on time. Up next, last but not least, Sylvestre. Okay.
Thanks, Diane. Really excited to be here this morning. Actually really happy to go last, so I had a chance to listen to everyone else. Had been frantically searching the catalog to see if Jackie Gleason had collected Harry Price and Manly Palmer Hall books. And of course he has. So it's always kind of nice to see when collecting areas overlap. So I'm the Rare Books Librarian and Coordinator of Public Services at the Kislak Center in Special Collections at the University of Miami. Special Collections focuses on materials related to the history of Florida, Southern Florida in particular, and the Caribbean, with an expanding focus into Central and South America. We have about 600 different archival collections, the most used being the records of Pan Am World Airways. We have tens of thousands of books, zines, and artist books covering a wide range of topics. And we recently acquired the J.I. Kislak collection of the early Americas exploration and navigation, a gift of more than 2,000 maps, books, and manuscripts. It's been a transformative gift for UM libraries, and it's in great company alongside Jackie Gleason. Next. You may know Jackie Gleason from such films as The Hustler, Smokey and the Bandit, or The Sting 2, but you probably know him best as Ralph Cramden from The Honeymooners. Gleason was born in New York in 1916 and died in 1987 in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Best known for his role in The Honeymooners, Gleason was an actor, comedian, writer, composer, and conductor. Introducing Gleason to visiting classes proves trickier as the years go by. Most students don't know who he is, although a few recognize him from The Hustler or maybe Smokey and the Bandit. I try, often without success, to compare Gleason to modern day comedians, but I find my references get stuck in the 1990s. It's most effective when I can share a clip of Gleason from The Honeymooners to show students the kind of performer he was. If students do recognize his name, it's usually from this performance venue, the Fillmore, Miami Beach at the Jackie Gleason Theater. Gleason's childhood, with the death of his brother and mother while he was young, and his father's abandonment, fueled a lot of his interest in what else there was in this world. He certainly wasn't shy about indulging in food and drink to make up for going without as a child, and I think his interest in unseen, hidden, or unknown connections came from a similar desire. In a 1981 2020 interview with Hugh Downs, Gleason touched upon his childhood. Quote, "My father disappeared when I was about 7 years old, never to show up again, and my mother died when I was quite young. I didn't start school until I was 8 years old because I had a brother who died when he was 14. And then with my father leaving, I was the only thing left that my mother had. And she was overly attentive to me. She didn't even want me to go to school. I was never allowed out in the street to play with the other kids. I would sit on the window and watch all the kids playing. And there was never enough to eat. As a matter of fact, I had to go to a shop where they gave you food. My mother would send me twice a week to pick up some bread or some spaghetti or something. And they had always put the label on it, free food. So the first thing I did when I got out of the store was to tear the label off. I was so embarrassed by it. So naturally, when I could afford to get food, I got a lot of it. And so it certainly started by the fact that I didn't have things as a child, and I was determined to get them. Gleason wasn't exactly public about his interest in the things beyond this world, but he wasn't entirely private about it either. He didn't bring it up often in interviews, but was a frequent caller on the 1950s Long John Neville show on WOR in New York State. The show aired midnight to 5:30 a.m., and UFOs were discussed almost daily, alongside topics such as witchcraft, parapsychology, hypnotism, conspiracy theories, and ghosts. On one show, Gleason offered $100,000 to anyone with physical proof of aliens visiting Earth. In the introduction to a biography of Neville, Gleason upped that amount to $1 million. In the introduction, Gleason goes on to say, quote, "I think it's instructive to ponder on worlds beyond this world, and I also think it's entertaining, because the best entertainment is entertainment that opens up your mind and tells you that the world is bigger than you thought it was," end quote. Next slide, please. So I've lost track of the number of times I've mimed Gleason's famous stage exit to students when explaining what the stick figure is in his book plate. And this is one of my all-time favorite book plates. I don't know which of my predecessors at the University of Miami designed this book plate, but I'll be forever grateful that they did. In 1964, Gleason was invited to move down and film the Jackie Gleason show on Miami Beach. He filmed the show here from 1966 until it ended in 1970. After Gleason's death in 1987, the university was contacted by his estate about his collection, and it was donated to special collections. There are about 1,700 books in total. Next slide, please. 12 to 1,300 of which relate to the occult, spiritualism, paranormal, magic, aliens, and ancient civilizations. I don't know if you can all make it out, but Psychic Party Games is always a student favorite. There's some interesting card games you can try to play when classes come through. There's a seriousness with which Gleason collected. All of his books purport to be legitimate studies of the topic at hand, and there are very few fiction works in the collection. The pulpiest items he had are joke books, but I haven't prepared anything from those materials. Gleason talked in interviews about being able to memorize scripts after a single reading, something that made him a bit difficult to work with when others forgot their lines. If we believe Gleason, he may well have had a vast store of knowledge accumulated from the books in his collections. The books bear many signs of use, from underlines to dog-eared pages to worn-out spines and failing perfect bindings. We keep Gleason's collection shelved together and is arranged in Library of Congress call number order, and we have never added items to Gleason's collection. Next. But because Gleason's collection is so fantastic, we've created what we call the Gleason Adjacent Collection. Materials in the Gleason Adjacent Collection continue the collecting spirit of his original collection and expand out to include different formats such as zines, artist books, games, and the occasional manuscript item. Adding to the Gleason Adjacent Collection has been a great experience and allows us to expand on subjects Gleason didn't cover. We have a few large related collections that, if not exactly Gleason adjacent, are very close, including 2 large science fiction fanzine collections, one of which belonged to Lenny Kaye, former guitarist for the Patti Smith Group. If you look closely, you can see in the local copy note in this catalog record that we add a note that this item relates to the Jackie Gleason collection to add another dimension of relationship beyond subject and genre terms. This lets us link our items together intellectually while still preserving Gleason's own collection. Next slide. Gleason adjacent books are among some of my favorite items to acquire for special collections, like this one that I bought from Kim a few years ago. Collecting from booksellers who are practitioners and/or scholars in these fields helped me build the collection from a non-expert perspective. Listening to the other presenters on this panel has been instructive and inspiring, and is the kind of community I've come to find around these materials. Next slide. Gleason and the adjacent collection books are heavily used in teaching with special collections. We'll share a Gleason book or two with classes that visit for a general overview of the collection, but there have been a handful of classes that really highlight the materials. I give an annual guest lecture to a religious studies course on death and dying, highlighting Gleason's collection, Spiritualism, and the Occult. Perhaps the most involved class is a creative writing course. In the course, and a project created by department head Christina Favretto, Students are escorted into the special collection stacks and given the opportunity to choose one Gleason book as inspiration for a project. Students get 5 minutes or so to pick a book, but they only get to pull one off the shelf. We encourage the students to pick whatever book feels like the right one for them, but once you pick a book, that's your selection. For the project, students are instructed to interact, engage, and create with the book. The book can't be altered or changed in any way. Instead, the students create items to be displayed with the book or that are inspired by it. And although the project trends more towards the creative writing aspect of the class, over the years, the students have put together some really great items. This one seen here is one of my favorites, and I think is actually from a bound copy of Harry Price's Journal of Psychical Research. Next slide, please. The student purchased this little notebook from Etsy and printed out these creepy eyeball end papers and then used collage to create the pages using other images from the Gleason book. Next slide. This is another one of my favorites, and if you go to the next slide, you will see that it's because the student took the time to draw out the Gleason's stick figure bookplate that immediately made it one of my favorites. Next slide. In 2014, my first Halloween at UM, we held a Jackie Gleason seance style event. We partnered with a UM theater department professor and a group of their students to bring parts of the Gleason collection to life. We created an exhibit of Gleason titles, and guests were given a guided tour by Christina Favretto. Each exhibit case contained one label that summoned a theater department student to enter the room and recite text from the book being viewed. The students then lingered with the group as the tour continued. This was a great event and a nice departure from the standard lecture or show and tell format. Next slide. Finally, I want to leave you with my favorite Gleason story, although I make no claims to its veracity. The facts of the story are these. The story was published in the National Enquirer in 1983, so take the source as reliable as you care. The story was never attributed to Gleason, but to his ex-wife. Jackie Gleason and Richard Nixon were in fact golf buddies, and they played in a celebrity golf tournament together in February of 1973. The story goes, late one night in 1973, Nixon showed up at Gleason's Florida home and invited him out for a drive. Nixon brought him to Homestead Air Force Base, about an hour south of Miami. Once on base, Nixon brought Gleason to a room containing the bodies of several deceased extraterrestrials. Gleason was apparently so shaken by the story that he locked himself away for several days upon his return home, and he never spoke of it. Now, would Gleason have been able to keep quiet about his experience, especially given his $1 million bounty for proof of extraterrestrial life? Or is this story about Richard Nixon, Jackie Gleason, and a Florida Air Force Base just plausible enough to have happened? Thank you.
Ooh, intrigue. Thanks, Jay. So that brings us to the conclusion of our speaker portion of today's panel. And I want to thank all of our speakers again for their wonderful presentations. Perhaps you're all pondering Nixon, aliens, and Jackie Gleason right now. But it is time for our Q&A. And as Brian is preparing the questions that you have asked in the chat on YouTube, I'm just going to give all of the panelists an opportunity to chime in, ask each other questions, or bring up that thing that you forgot because it was all so fast. You all have the floor.
Everyone put your microphones on, please. We all muted while the other ones were talking, but. Well, so as to not have too much dead air, I will get things started. And I pulled a painting off my wall of an actual mediumistic art piece by a guy named Bert Schomburg. This is from 1964, but it relates to what Rhiannon was talking about because he was a follower of Manly P. Hall. And after Jack Parsons died, his widow, Marjorie Cameron, who was also a witch practitioner and artist, was the partner of Bert Schomburg for a while. And he's relatively unknown, but this is one of my favorite paintings in my collection. So anyway, that's just a little.
That was a cool thing about working at the Getty Research Institute at the time, because we could look in the archives of some of these artists, and sometimes we would have their library card catalogs, and you could see how, like, if you saw something in their art that reminded you of a manuscript in the whole collection, you could go and look and see that they probably owned one of Manley's books, and that actually was the inspiration. He was really prolific.
Yeah, I have some of his poetry books, and they're amazing. I mean, besides like his better known works, and also a lecture that he did on the ancient Hebrew character Melchizedek, who became quite an important character in Gnostic and medieval magic philosophies and whatnot. So anyway, another thing that I wanted to say before I ask some questions, we do have a lot of other speakers that are speaking throughout the fair on these topics, including tomorrow at noon, we have Brian Cotnoir. I don't know if the glare catches this, but he is a zine artist and also an author of several books on alchemy and related magic and Neoplatonic subjects. And this is his newest zine called On Alchemy and the Symbolics of Color. But he'll actually be speaking tomorrow at noon Eastern Time on Alchemy and Dreams. So make sure you all tune into that. You can go through brooklynbookfair.com, where in less than 10 minutes now, the Brooklyn Antiquarian Fair Virtual Edition 2020 will be opening. And we have many, many books related to this topic as well. And throughout the fair, I'll be letting anybody who's tuning in know about that. And a question that we had on the YouTube link was from Dan Fleek. And he asked, are there any other zines, and I'll leave this open to anyone from the panel who wants to answer. Are there any other zines like Hellebore that have not been mentioned yet? Or any other zines that any of you would recommend? And I'm assuming that would be contemporary. So I just mentioned one by Brian Cotnoir, but take it away.
Oh, I know of many. So Hellebore's a really great folk horror zine magazine, and there's a few actually. Britain right now is coming out with a lot of related, like regional related, like Weird Walk is another one. Fiddler's Green from the States talks a lot about folklore and green magic. If you want to email me, I have lists, and it can some of the booksellers that I mentioned on my last slide sell those zines as well. So there's a lot. There's a lot out there.
Jay, do you want to add anything to that, Jay?
I mean, I would like to. I'm kind of blanking on titles right now. I do know that we pretty actively acquire a lot of zines about the occult, spiritual, paranormal, UFOs. Kim, I know you mentioned Librarian books on your slide, and we get a lot of materials from them. It's not really a zine, it's more of a traditional magazine publication, but there's a series called Gnosis, which one of the folks at Librarian was a longtime editor of. So again, it's that sort of practitioner, bookseller, collector interface that's been working really well.
And that's, Jay, just for those who are on YouTube, that's Gnosis, Noces.
It's Gnosis.
Thank you.
Is that Eric Davis?
It might be.
Okay.
Who's awesome, by the way. Eric is cool.
Yeah. I did an interview with him on his podcast last year about a songwriter that I've been studying for about 25 years. So I love Eric and would love to get him as part of the Brooklyn Fair in the future. So another question that we have from, let me see, Weeble Wam. Question for Kim and or Rhiannon. How rare is the Malleus Maleficarum? How often do you see good quality copies come up for sale, and what is the price range?
Rhiannon, that might be better. I mean, I know of a couple on the market right now, but
yeah, so the thing about the Malleus Maleficarum is that there's a lot of editions of it because it was extremely popular. So I think the first one was published in the 15th century, but then there's a whole bunch that are published even in that period and then later on. And so the price range kind of varies quite a bit depending on which one it is or how early it is. I think that we just sold one in a sale in London, and I should remember how much it sold for. I think it was in the like £30,000 zone. That might be more than it really was. But there's a huge variation. I've never handled a copy myself, but it's also a book, you know, it's a law book, which are books that tend to get quite heavy use. So it's harder to find a kind of pristine copy because they would have been kind of carved around and, you know.
I particularly like the ones that you see that have all that waste paper. You know, it's sort of, again, talking about it as a print specimen, I think is really fascinating. And the more marginalia in it, the better, right? Like, you know, finding a pristine copy would be a little boring, honestly.
Way. Although
yeah,
find
one that has either provenance or some kind of notes, I think would be awesome. Rather.
No, I completely agree with you. And I know you asked specifically about the Malleus Maleficarum, but I just want to mention that because it's a law book, and actually there are other law books that talk about witches, often borrowing heavily from the Malleus Maleficarum, but if that would be something that's like out of your price range, there's tons of like interesting smaller works that address a lot of these issues. One of them is a book called the Neue Laienspiegel, which is a German guide to self-representation in the law. And there's like a second edition of it that has amazing woodcuts by Schofelein, including one that shows all the evil things that witches do, like they milk your cows before you wake up in the morning, and they tap the sap out of your trees, and they fly on the but there's a lot of places to find this material that aren't necessarily the big ticket items.
Right. Yeah, and the other thing about the MM, as I call it, is it's funny how much these guys knew about practicing. You know, they had it's almost like a classification of demonology as well. So they knew a lot, considering, you know,
they were
prosecuting, you know, for. So that you'll find that a lot in the sort of genre of treatise with those law books and witchcraft and trials and things like that.
You know, there's kind of like here's a list of what not to do.
Right. But
which I think kind of explains the popularity of this book, which is actually kind of violent and really.
Yeah, absolutely. Very oppressive, very misogynistic. And that's why I say, like, have people read it? Like, you know, it's hard to get through, right?
All right, so a few other questions. The first one was asked several times, is whether this is going to be an archive video. And the answer is yes, that the webinar will be a permanent link after we're finished recording. And another question for Eyob from Dico Faust.
Hey, Dico.
And he asks, will there be digitizations of the Ethiopian scrolls or on the British Library site or otherwise? So maybe that could be a more general question about digitization of these type of manuscripts in general. And I'm sort of curious about like collections and budgets that are focused on these alternative subjects or traditionally alternative subjects, which you're now seeing in, you know, museum exhibitions in the Guggenheim about occult Paris and mediumistic abstract artists and whatnot. It seems like it's becoming more mainstream, at least for curators and museum collectors.
So,
great question. So
Yeah.
So for now, we've digitized around 300 Ethiopian manuscripts. Priority was given to the illuminated manuscripts that came from the Magdala expedition, which were route of 1868. So I've managed to squeeze in a couple of amulet scrolls. So all those mentioned today have been fully digitized. And a point that I didn't make at the start was basically a big part of my job is cataloging these manuscripts. And when you have a digitization project, you cannot catalog in great detail, so you can only give a brief description. It is one of the challenging aspects of cataloging amulet scrolls or magician handbooks or practitioners handbooks. They're quite challenging, and we're dealing with a dead language. So they do take up time. So sometimes when we work on digitization, our cataloging is just try to make it more just focus on the discoverability of it. But in terms of digitization projects coming up for Amulet Scrolls specifically, I'm not aware of that yet. I hope the person that asked this question, if you pray, maybe we can digitize the 40. But for now, the library's budget is sort of focused on engagement and making the collection more discoverable.
Okay, I have another question, and I need to have my glasses to read it. So sorry, looking directly into camera. Ethan K writes, I have a question on finding 18th and 19th century spiritualist pamphlets. They haven't come up in antiquarian book fairs I've been to. Where do you usually see them up for sale? And sorry, I was writing those questions down earlier, and so I needed to read off the screen for that one. But anyway, I do want to say that the Brooklyn Antiquarian Virtual Book Fair is actually now live, and we're going to go a little bit over on this webinar so as to not crash the site. So if anybody's here and they're planning to go over, maybe hang out for a few more minutes and enjoy our speakers for a little bit longer. We do see quite a lot of spiritualist pamphlets, at least at the Brooklyn Antiquarian Fair. I can't say that about all the fairs that Marvin does. Some of them, the Manhattan Fair or the Boston Fair, are a little bit more geared towards traditional canonized books and those areas of interest. But in Brooklyn, we tend to see a lot more edgy material. And throughout the fair, I'll be mentioning some of those before and after some of the webinars. I didn't actually pull any for this specific one now, but does anybody want to talk about seeing these kind of spiritualist pamphlets that are popping up?
Well, this is Diane. I'm just going to jump in here for a second because what seems to ring out in my memory, at least, is always, always, always ask a book dealer to look for things if you are interested in them, because they love doing that work. So, and also I would say that, and Kim and Rhiannon and well, everyone can talk more about like their experience at fairs, but I find that often the book dealers that I know and love will target who might be coming based on wherever they are going with their materials and bring specific things to maybe entangle or tantalize the market. If anyone else wants to chime in on that, I also have one question for Eyob that a listener really wanted to ask.
You know, there's a lot of great discovery options online as well. And, you know, with full transparency, I will tell you, you know, because I don't sort of sacred my scouting. I tend to scour like these little sort of friends of the library and garage shells, you know, or estate sales for a lot of that material, because it's considered almost, pamphlets a lot of times are almost in that ephemera group. You know, they were mass produced, the paper's bad, but you know, they're out there, you know, so with a little bit of web crawling and you know, again, that focused, like Diane said, that going to the back of the ABAA directory and look under maybe occult or folks, you know, that do spirituality or religion as well, that kind of crosses over. You can contact those folks with subject. Always indexing, as librarian speaking, look at your index.
Right. That's awesome.
And then last week, the William Reese Company had an e-list titled Spiritual-ish Philosophers, Prophets, and Zealots, and we bought a spiritualist pamphlet from that. So, I mean, online is definitely a good place to be.
Yeah, go to the Lily Dale Assembly. I don't know if they have their catalog up online to search, but they have, you know, wonderful catalog up there. Probably the most comprehensive spiritualist collection in the country. Possibly it's private, but you know, you can certainly get maybe lists from them too.
Jay, I had a question for you because when you were talking, when I think of Jackie Gleason, besides the honeymooners, like what immediately comes to my mind is his acid trip in the 1969 movie Skidoo, and also the album cover, or the album that he produced or wrote music for, that has a Salvador Dali painting on the cover. And I think it was a unique painting, or it was an original commission. But I know that Salvador Dali came to Los Angeles in 1948 and threw a masquerade ball. And that was when he came into contact with Walt Disney, who hired him in the early 1950s to create a piece that I think was supposed to be just a short film. And maybe I'm kind of grasping for straws here, but I wonder, in what way were these kind of post-vaudeville, just what seemed like, kind of all American television celebrities in general, kind of, gravitating towards surrealists and occultists and what we would call conspiracy theorists today. And maybe, Rhiannon could chime in on this as well, because I know, studying Los Angeles, like everything from the guy who was like one of the founders of baseball, Alexander Goodwill Spaulding, was a theosophist, and actually used a lot of the people that were a part of the Pasadena Theosophy Lodge, and made them like icons of the founding of baseball or whatever. So, there's a lot of more esoteric underpinnings to the glitz and glamour of Los Angeles. And so,
I mean, for Gleason's part, I haven't seen the movie, and I now need to find this album cover, and probably revisit his biography. But part of his collection also are celebrity biographies, a lot of his contemporaries. It was very clear, he had his group of friends, he was interested in what they were doing. And like Gleason said, and like I alluded to, he was definitely interested in indulging in whatever he could get his hands on. So I suspect, anything he could do to kind of expand whatever horizons were on hand for him is something he would have been interested in. And kind of weirdly, there's also the Salvador Dali Museum in St. Petersburg, Florida. So there are these kind of Florida connections that do tend to keep popping up.
let me see.
We are at about 10 minutes after noon Eastern time, so I just wanted to check back in with Brian on timing. There are a couple of questions that I've got in, although Eyob might have to drop out because he's having technical difficulties on his side. But Brian, how are we doing on time?
Let's do your 2 questions.
Okay. So first, we'll try Eyob if you're still with us. You are, I think.
Your mic's dropping out, Diane.
Sorry. It looks like we lost Eyob at the moment. But Tansy, I wanted to ask you, because you talked a lot about exhibitions promoting collections, and I think that everyone actually on the panel has done some kind of exhibition outreach, but can you talk a little bit more about how exhibitions promote or could do more to promote collections and what you've experienced like that?
So our exhibition was very focused on a particular subject, and when I went into curating it, it was very much about how we could promote that we had these holdings, not just in the area of stage magic or secular magic, but also all of the things that branched off from that in the subject more widely. So a big part we normally have an exhibition program which runs 2 exhibitions each year. Our current one, which I also worked on, is on Dickens and childhood. And so looking at a lot of social conditions and promoting our collections around that as well. I think they can really work to engage both our regular users because our exhibition space is in a bit of a corridor, people are regularly walking through the space, and kind of make them aware of this material, which is kind of hidden to some extent in special collections, but also bringing in the public. A big part of what we have to do is public engagement. So bringing in the public to both engage with those materials in an exhibition, but also through events and through more web presence. So all of our exhibitions ideally have a web presence as well, which carries on after the exhibition, and that allows us to build on the kind of digital presence of a collection. So kind of thinking about the question about digitization, we had some material that came out of the collection in 2019 that got digitized and is now online open access, but we also in the past have digitized a lot for commercial databases, which is pretty much the way, unfortunately, it's going now. But that obviously makes things much more accessible when people do subscribe to the databases, and expands the reach of the collection.
Great, great. Anybody else want to?
I was just going to say, I love that idea of what, in lieu of that with outreach, what Jay had with outreach and sort of engagement on reaction to the materials, and then creating another object per se, because it gets students really wrap their head around this idea of construction and book as object too. And then to that idea of like, oh, their work, you know, maybe in the special collections someday, or used in this way for instruction or curriculum development. I think is a really cool idea. And I think students, San Diego State does that a lot too, with their book arts collection. So that's a really great way to engage folks.
Yeah, I mean, anything we can do to kind of break down the barriers that special collections kind of erects around itself. I mean, I really like Tansy's point about acquiring some of the same titles for the general circulating collection. I think that's a great way to get these materials into the hands of more people. One of the nice things I really liked about our Halloween event was that we let the students pick the parts of the text that they wanted to recite. So we let them kind of find something that was theirs. We picked the books, but then from there it was on them to figure out how to perform it.
On the same vein, I just wanted to add something that I meant to but forgot to mention, which is that the Manley Palmer Hall collection is completely digitized on the Getty's website. Actually, it was one of the first whole collections that was kind of targeted for digitization. So some of the manuscripts are actually digitized in a slightly inconvenient way while they were still working out the kinks, but it's mostly all now being done on Internet Archive, so it's very easy to flip through, and you can kind of have full access to that material. I think a lot of people who work in special collections have this experience of when you digitize something, it actually increases the demand for it to be seen in the reading room because people know it's there. And that's something that I really appreciated about the GRIs. You don't have to have a PhD to use the reading room. You don't have to have an academic affiliation. You can go and apply for a card and you just kind of tell them, you know, this is my project that I'm working on. This is why I want to see this. And that's one of the reasons why we had kind of a wide diversity of people who came to see the manuscripts for partially what were kind of essentially religious reasons. They didn't have to have a real research reason. Yeah, but I appreciate hearing the ways in which special collections are being opened up to people, which I think is also good.
Yeah, I think this pandemic has also prompted, at least from what I know, folks to use digital surrogates because they can't physically come to a reading room. So I think it's prompted a lot of that work as well to get things digitized if able out there, because you just can't, people just physically right now can't come to certain special collections depending on their policies.
I am sad that Eyob I guess is having a technical difficulty, because what I wanted to ask, but maybe some of you would also have a reaction to, is the idea of digitizing the amulets, which were not meant to be read, right? I mean, obviously certain types of people are very interested in reading them for research purposes, but they are a magical object, right? Mm-hmm. It's hard to digitize that to a certain degree. Magic books have this maybe a bit more than other books, so I think we all know that there's no real replacement for the physical book. But for magical books, sometimes it doesn't even matter. You can't read them. It's a mysterious code. Like they kind of exist to be appreciated as an object versus something that you would read in the bathtub.
Yeah, there's several books, Sumatran books, the Batak very similar. They're magic books. The language is like this amalgamation of like Sanskrit and the sort of bi-regional language, the local language, only to be read by certain practitioners, the shaman or the spiritual leaders in that community. So it becomes this object. And I was going to ask him similar how the materiality, how the inks and the paper were made, if that is part of the process too of making this talisman. So we will have to email.
We'll have to be continued. Yeah.
Yeah, continue.
Yeah, Eyob has joined us from his holiday. And so his internet connection was not solid. And unfortunately, he couldn't stay with us the rest of this time. But I will just say, give a plug out to, there are several videos that Eyob has done on YouTube about Ethiopian manuscripts and about the amulet manuscripts themselves. So I know there was a question on YouTube about how are they worn exactly? And some of that is covered in his very short and very lovely and informative videos that are on YouTube. So just look for his name.
Sorry, I just had one thing to ask Rhiannon. Was there the woman that was the collector? Did she have an anathema on one of her labels? Did I see that?
I think she did.
Okay, it said something about steel, and I was like, oh,
very much steel, not this book.
Yes. Okay.
A little magic on Elias Ashmole.
That's very cool.
We probably should wrap it up here pretty soon, but I just wanted to mention I had read a biography of Manly P. Hall about 5 years ago, in which the biographer, who was somewhat skeptical and negative in tone, more like a journalist, he described Manly P. Hall's collection of Hermetic texts and scrolls as being third and fourth rate, which to me wasn't really a detractor, but more of something to recommend the collection, because I'm generally drawn to things that are more kitschy or campy or third rate anyway. And I think maybe just because there's more room to breathe and the spotlight sort of off things that are outside of the main canon. And that's really been, for me, the focus in programming, particularly the Brooklyn Antiquarian Book Fair for the last few years. And I wonder if in some way the idea of like first to fourth rate has sort of changed over the last 5 or 10 years as we dig deeper into these things. Is the canon, still basically set in the way it was, or is it evolving as we become more familiar with these, other texts that are outside of the canon? And that, I guess that also kind of parlays into things not necessarily being institutionalized, but still out there to be found at book fairs and other things.
Yeah, I think that people are just recognizing the importance of some of these smaller, kind of weirder things. And it's true that some of the 17th and 18th century alchemical manuscripts aren't like insanely attractive, but they are important. And that's kind of part of the collection ethos of the GRI, right? Is, I don't think the collection is third rate, but there are like lavish medieval manuscripts of the Splendor Solis, the Heiligen Dreifaltigkeit, these like very famous, very beautiful alchemical manuscripts, but those weren't used by people. They weren't really used by people. They were art objects rather than magical objects, I think, in a great degree. So the things that are less obvious, that are kind of less of a thing you would display as art, but are so useful for study or practice, are, I think, increasingly being recognized.
I think that's true of kind of book history and print studies more generally, is that people are now much more interested in what people read, the cheaper forms of printing, the ephemeral, and the kind of stuff that doesn't survive in collectors' collections. And that's what we are kind of trying to do more of collecting, is the kind of the pamphlet material, the cheaper produced material, just to balance out what we have in our collections.
Yeah, pulp is a large part of it too. Like a lot of these pulp magic book grimoires that were in various iterations and copies are like really fascinating because you can see the print history, how the typography changed on the design as well. So there's a lot of like interesting, even early 20th century stuff that's sort of just wasted because the paper was so cheap, but it's absolutely fascinating to find.
And the ideas therein are responding to their time as
Mhm.
well.
Yep.
So, you know, we have this like, you know, idea that certain of these things are timeless and gravitate towards that. But, you know, I think part of the intriguing aspect of collecting is what is timestamp and what sort of reflects how people who are outside of the mainstream are trying to come up with ideas to solve social and personal and spiritual problems. Anyway, we could go on forever, and you guys are amazing, and I loved hearing you talk, and hope that we get to do this again. But we do have to wrap it up for now.
We do indeed.
So thank you, Diane. Do you want to say any parting words?
No, I just wanted to thank everyone for their presentations today. I wanted to thank Getman's Fairs for having us. Hopefully this is the beginning of more sessions like this in the future. I wanted to thank Brian for all of his encouragement as we went through, and a shout out to Neko, who's been our tech guy all the way through this session. It's been great. I hope everyone sticks around for the fair for the next 3 days and today as well. And have a good Friday. Have a good weekend. That's my thanks.
Thank you very much, Diane.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Yeah, everyone, you get a round of
This was
applause.
fantastic.
It was great to be with you all.
All right. Have a great weekend, everyone. Go to brooklynbookfair.com and enjoy shopping around with all the great dealers. And programming begins again tomorrow at noon Eastern time. So,
Great.
see you then.
All right. Thanks, everyone.